I never imagined that something as ordinary as a haircut could turn into a moment that would haunt my thoughts long after I walked out of the shop. For most of my life, haircuts were routine, something you scheduled because you had to, a chore you barely paid attention to, and one of those appointments you sometimes even forgot until the mirror reminded you. But that evening, as I pushed open the glass door of a small barbershop in Manhattan, I stepped into a chapter of my life that I hadn't expected, a story that began with nothing more than a chair, a pair of scissors, and a stranger whose presence made the air shift around me. My name is Alex. I'm 27, born and raised in New York. I've always been a creature of habit, someone who hides comfortably behind deadlines, projects, and routines. My friends like to tease me about being predictable, the guy who never strays far from what's safe. I don't gamble, I don't look for trouble, and I rarely find myself in situations where adrenaline runs higher than the pressure of a looming marketing campaign. That's how I like it, or at least, that's how I thought I liked it. That night, though, the city felt heavier than usual. The sidewalks were slick from a recent rain. The neon lights of the storefronts reflected on the puddles like broken shards of color. I was in a mood I couldn't quite explain. Restless, maybe. Irritated. The kind of mood where even the smallest things make you feel off balance. My reflection in the shop windows confirmed what my friend had told me earlier that week. My hair was a mess, my beard uneven, and my whole appearance screamed of someone too buried in work to notice the obvious. The barbershop was called Sharp Edge. It wasn't one of those flashy places with polished marble counters and overpriced products lined up like trophies. From the outside, it looked modest, a narrow window with gold lettering, the faint sound of clippers buzzing inside. The kind of place you'd walk past without giving much thought. But I stopped in front of it, staring at the sign longer than necessary, as if some invisible hand was urging me to step in. The bell above the door gave a sharp chime when I pushed it open. Warmth hit me immediately, and so did the scent, clean, sharp, a mix of leather, aftershave, and faint tobacco smoke that clung to the wooden walls. My eyes swept the room quickly, half out of habit, half because I didn't want to look like I was stalling. A couple of chairs were empty. A vintage mirror lined the far wall, and the faint hum of jazz played from a speaker tucked somewhere out of sight. It felt old-fashioned but alive, like a corner of the city untouched by time. And then I saw him. Jason. He was standing by one of the chairs, his back to me at first, arranging his tools in a way that looked almost ceremonial. He moved with precision, not the rushed motions you expect from someone counting customers by the hour, but slow, deliberate gestures, as though even the placement of a comb mattered. When he turned around, our eyes met, and in that instant the shop, the noise of the street, the whole restless city seemed to fade into the background. Jason had the kind of presence you don't prepare for. He wasn't just good-looking, though he was undeniably. It was more than that. It was the way he carried himself, confident without arrogance, sharp without trying too hard. There was an ease in his movements that told me he was comfortable in his own skin, and yet there was something unreadable in his gaze, like a locked door you weren't sure you were allowed to open. "Evening," he said, his voice low and steady, with that calmness that made it sound like he already knew you. "Looking for a cut?" It was such a simple question, but for some reason I hesitated before answering. My throat felt dry, my hands shoved themselves into the pockets of my jacket, and I nodded as if I'd just agreed to something much bigger than a haircut. "Yeah," I said finally. "I could use one." He smiled, not wide, not forced, just enough to feel like a challenge. "Take a seat. You came at the right time." I walked over to the chair. He pointed to my steps heavier than they should have been. It wasn't nervousness, not exactly, but something sharper, something that made me hyper-aware of myself. The sound of my shoes on the wooden floor, the way my jacket felt too tight on my shoulders, the silent stretching between us while he draped the black cape around me. From a mirror in front of me, I could see him up close now. The sharp line of his jaw, the careful way he studied me before lifting the clippers. He didn't start immediately. Instead, he asked, "So what do you do?" "Marketing," I answered quickly. Too quickly. "I work with a tech company." He tilted his head slightly, as though he'd already guessed. "That explains it. You've got the look of someone who spends too much time in front of a screen." I laughed nervously, shifting in the chair. Is that your professional opinion? It's my opinion, he said, brushing the comb through my hair, his tone calm, but with a glimmer of something playful. Professional or not, I'll let you decide. Our eyes met again in the mirror, and I caught myself holding his gaze longer than necessary. There was something unsettling about it, not because it was aggressive, but because it wasn't. He looked at me like he could read past the polite smiles, past the surface-level answers. I wasn't used to that. Most people ask about your job or your weekend because they're filling the silence. Jason asked like he actually cared what the answer might reveal. The clippers buzzed to life, loud and sharp in the quiet shop. I felt the first pass against my scalp, and with it came a strange awareness of just how close he was. His hands steady against my head, his focus unwavering, his movements precise. Normally, a haircut is mechanical. You sit, you zone out, you wait for it to end. But this was different. Every gesture carried weight, as though I wasn't just another customer, but someone worth the full measure of his attention. And the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became, that invisible current between us. I found myself paying attention to his voice, the cadence of his questions, the way his expression changed when I answered. He asked about my work, my hobbies, even about where in the city I'd grown up, and it all felt too natural, too easy, like we'd skipped past the small talk into something else entirely. But beneath the surface, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a provocation in the way he looked at me, like he was testing something. Testing me. And I didn't know whether I wanted to pass or fail. By the time the haircut was halfway through, I wasn't thinking about how my hair looked anymore. I was thinking about why I couldn't stop noticing him. Why the silence between his questions made my chest feel tight. Why it seemed impossible to look away from the reflection of his eyes in the mirror. It was absurd, I told myself. I was overthinking. It was just a haircut, just a barber making small talk. And yet, as the minutes dragged on, the thought pressed deeper. Maybe this wasn't as ordinary as it seemed. Maybe it wasn't ordinary at all. I thought that once I walked out of the barbershop that evening, the strange pull I had felt would fade. It was just a haircut, I told myself again and again, nothing more. A man with charisma, good at conversation, maybe too good. A temporary distraction from the usual rhythm of my life. That should have been the end of it. But as the days turned into weeks, Jason's presence refused to leave my mind. His voice, his questions, the way his eyes had lingered on mine in the mirror. They returned to me when I least expected it, like a song I couldn't shake off no matter how hard I tried. It started innocently. A message here, a suggestion there. He remembered things I had mentioned offhand, books I was reading, the project that had kept me late in the office, my complaints about the subway breaking down again. He sent a text one evening. You said you liked the view from the Brooklyn Bridge at night. Ever walked it on a weekday? It's almost empty then. I stared at that message longer than I should have, debating whether to answer. It wasn't unusual, not exactly. People invited each other out all the time. But the weight in my chest told me that if I said yes, I was stepping into something I didn't fully understand. I said yes anyway. The first time we met outside the shop, it felt different. No clippers, no cape, no mirror between us. Just two men walking side by side through the city. The conversation was the same, effortless, winding, filled with jokes that made the corners of my mouth twitch even when I tried to resist, but the setting made it sharper. We weren't barber and customer anymore. We were something else, something undefined. The city at night can be both comforting and unforgiving. The streets empty out, the hum of traffic softens, and shadows stretch longer than they should. As we walked across the bridge, the lights of Manhattan flickered like fire on the water. Jason leaned on the railing, talking about music he loved, about how he came to New York with nothing but a suitcase and ambition, about how he never wanted to live a life that felt ordinary. I listened, maybe too closely, storing every detail as though they were clues to a puzzle I couldn't stop myself from trying to solve. What unsettled me wasn't what he said, but how he said it. There was a quiet intensity in his words, a deliberate calmness, as if he was revealing pieces of himself on purpose, testing how much I could handle before I looked away. And I didn't look away. I couldn't. That night became the first of many. We found excuses to meet, grabbing coffee after work, wandering through Central Park when the leaves turned red and gold, slipping into quiet streets in the village where no one seemed to pay attention. It was always the same pattern. We laughed too easily, we shared too much, and then, when the silence came, it was heavy with everything left unsaid. That silence frightened me and thrilled me all at once. I told no one. Not my friends, not my family. It was easier to invent excuses. Late nights at the office, sudden errands, the vague just needed some air. They believed me because I had always been reliable, always predictable. But inside, something was unraveling. Jason was a magnet, and I was being pulled whether I wanted it or not. One evening, we walked through the narrow streets of Chinatown, the air filled with the smell of roasted chestnuts and fried dumplings. Neon signs glowed overhead, and Jason's face lit up in shifting colors: red, green, yellow. He was telling a story about a disastrous date he'd once had, the kind of story that should have made me laugh without thinking, but I was barely listening. I was too aware of the space between us, too aware of the way strangers glanced at us, as though two men walking together carried some unspoken meaning. And that's when the fear began to take hold. It wasn't fear of Jason, not exactly. It was fear of what being seen with him meant. Fear of the questions that might come, of the assumptions people would make. Fear of losing the neat, carefully constructed identity I had carried my whole life. I had never questioned it before. I had never needed to. And now, with every step beside him, it felt like that identity was cracking open. There were moments when I almost convinced myself to stop, to pull back before it went too far, to let the messages fade unanswered, to let the silence reclaim its place. But then he'd appear again, waiting for me outside a cafe, or sending a late-night text with nothing more than a half-serious joke, and I'd feel the same tug, the same current pulling me back. It was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. One night, after another long walk, we ended up sitting on the steps of the New York Public Library. The city moved around us, headlights streaking past, people hurrying by with barely a glance in our direction. Jason leaned back on the stone railing, looking at me in that way he had, the way that made me feel exposed, like he could see the thoughts I hadn't spoken. "You're quiet," he said finally, his voice steady. Too quiet for someone who claims to have 1,000 ideas in his head. I laughed, but sounded thin even to me. Just tired. He didn't believe me. I could tell by the way he tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "No, you're thinking about something. Or someone." The weight of his words pressed down on me. My throat tightened, and I searched for something safe to say, something that wouldn't reveal how close to the truth he already was. But all I managed was a shrug. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded, humming like an electric wire stretched too tight. And in that silence, I realized that I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't name. I wanted to step forward. I wanted to retreat. Both at once. The nights blurred together after that. Our conversations grew deeper, layered with unspoken tension. He asked questions that lingered long after I went home, about whether I was happy, whether I ever felt like I was living someone else's life, whether I believed people could change who they were. They weren't casual questions. They were challenges, provocations, as though he was daring me to confront the truths I had avoided. And the more I tried to resist, the stronger the pull became. I found myself searching for him in the crowd, wondering when his next message would come, replaying our conversations in my head when I should have been focused on work. I caught myself smiling at nothing, only to snap back to the fear that followed close behind. What if someone noticed? What if someone asked? What would I say? It was a double life, though not the kind anyone would recognize from the outside. On the surface, I was still the dependable Alex, the marketing professional, the guy who never strayed too far from routine. But beneath it, I was unraveling, pulled into a world I didn't fully understand, a world that both thrilled and terrified me. And Jason was at the center of it all, the invisible magnet that drew me closer every day, even as I told myself I should walk away. The force I couldn't explain, the one that made the city feel sharper, louder, more alive whenever he was near. It was the beginning of something, though I didn't know what. All I knew was that I couldn't stop. Even if stopping was the safer choice, the logical choice. I had stepped into a current too strong to resist, and it was carrying me somewhere I had never been before. I had been carrying the secret for too long. It pressed down on me during the day like a stone in my chest and whispered at me in the quiet hours of the night when I lay staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. For weeks I had walked through the city with Jason as though we were part of some hidden world, a world that belonged only to us, invisible to everyone else. It had been intoxicating at first, even liberating in a strange way. But as the days passed, the weight of silence became unbearable. You can only live in shadows for so long before the darkness starts to feel like a prison. My friends had noticed the changes. They joked about how distracted I had become, how I disappeared without explanation, how my phone buzzed late into the evening when we were supposed to be watching a game or catching up over drinks. Their laughter was harmless on the surface, but I felt the questions underneath it, unspoken but sharp. And with every passing week, the tension grew heavier until finally I reached a breaking point. It was a cold Friday evening when I decided to tell them. We were at our usual spot, a small bar in the East Village where the lighting was low and the noise of conversation created a kind of safety net, a place where you could say things without feeling like the whole world was listening. I sat across from Claire and Matthew, two of the people who had known me longest, the ones who had seen me through every stage of my so-called predictable life. My beer sat untouched in front of me, the condensation dripping slowly down the glass, and I could feel my heart pounding as though it wanted to escape my chest. They were talking about something trivial, Matthew's new job, Claire's latest dating disaster, but I barely heard them. My thoughts were too loud, my pulse too fast. Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "There's something I need to tell you," I said, my voice louder than I intended. They both turned to me, surprised by the seriousness in my tone. "What is it?" Claire asked, her eyebrows lifting slightly. I hesitated, my throat suddenly dry. For a moment, I thought about backing out, brushing it off as nothing. But I had promised myself I wouldn't run anymore. I had promised myself I would say the words, even if my voice shook. "I've been seeing someone," I said slowly. "Someone different." Matthew grinned. "About time. Who's the lucky girl?" The words caught in my chest. This was the moment. The fork in the road I couldn't avoid. I took a deep breath, feeling the heat rise in my face. "It's not a girl," I said. The silence that followed was immediate, sharp, as though the noise of the bar had suddenly faded away. I forced myself to continue. "His name is Jason." Claire's eyes widened, her lips parting as though she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Matthew blinked, his grin fading into something unreadable. The silence stretched on, and every second of it pressed down on me like a weight. I rushed to fill it, my words tumbling out too fast. "I didn't plan this. It just happened. He's different, and I didn't want to hide it from you anymore." Finally, Claire spoke, her voice soft but cautious. "Alec, are you sure?" The question cut deeper than I expected. Was I sure? No, not in the way she meant. But I was sure that Jason had changed something inside me, something I couldn't ignore. "Yes," I said firmly, though my hands trembled under the table. Matthew leaned back in his chair, his expression guarded. "Wow, I didn't see that coming." He took a long sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving mine. "But okay, if that's who you are, then that's who you are." His words were meant to be neutral, maybe even supportive, but the way he said them, flat, detached, left me cold. Claire reached across the table, touching my hand briefly. "We just want you to be happy," she said. And though her smile was genuine, I could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the questions she didn't dare ask. The rest of the night passed in a blur. They tried to return to normal conversation, but the air between us had shifted. The ease we once shared had cracked, and though they didn't say anything cruel, the distance was undeniable. I walked home with the city buzzing around me, neon lights reflecting off the wet pavement, feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. I had told the truth, but the truth hadn't set me free. It had only opened the door to a new kind of loneliness. And that was when the second blow came. I don't know what I expected when I opened Jason's message that night. Maybe a joke, maybe an invitation, Maybe just one of his casual check-ins that had become the highlight of my evenings. But instead, the words on the screen made my stomach twist. Sorry I didn't mention this earlier. There's something you should know. I've been seeing someone else too. It's nothing serious, but I didn't want you to find out the wrong way. I read the message again and again, hoping I had misunderstood, but the meaning didn't change. The world around me seemed to tilt, the floor beneath me unsteady. My chest tightened, my thoughts spun out of control. He had been seeing someone else. All those nights, all those conversations, all those silences that had felt charged with meaning. Had I imagined it? Had I been nothing more than a distraction, a passing amusement in his life? I wanted to call him, to demand answers, to ask why he hadn't told me from the start. But I didn't. Instead, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone, the screen glowing in the dark like a cruel reminder of my own naivety. The irony was bitter. The very night I had gathered the courage to share my truth with my friends, to step into the open for the first time, was the night I discovered that the foundation of what I had built with Jason was already fractured. Trust, the thing I had risked so much to give, had been broken before it even had the chance to solidify. Sleep was impossible. I lay awake, my thoughts replaying every moment with him, every look, every word, searching for signs I had missed. Were there clues in his silences? In the way he sometimes avoided direct questions? Had he been holding back from the start, letting me believe in something that wasn't as real as I thought? The doubts spread like cracks in glass, each one sharp and painful. I thought about the way my friends had looked at me earlier, the hesitation in their voices, the subtle shift in their expressions. And now, layered on top of that, was the betrayal I felt from Jason. I was caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The city outside was alive, but I felt isolated, sealed in a bubble of my own making. Every sound, the honk of a taxi, the shout of a passerby, the distant wail of a siren, felt distant, muffled, as though I were underwater. The world went on, oblivious to the storm inside me. By morning, the decision was clear. I couldn't ignore what I had learned. I couldn't continue walking through the city with Jason as though nothing had changed. The magnet that had once pulled me so strongly now felt dangerous, a force that threatened to tear me apart. But knowing that and accepting it were two different things. Even as anger burned in me, even as disappointment weighed heavily on my chest, part of me still longed for him, still remembered the way his words had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't before. That longing made the betrayal cut even deeper. I had stepped into this world thinking I could handle it, thinking I could balance the thrill with the fear. But illusions don't last forever. And when they break, they don't just crack, they shatter. And I was left alone, surrounded by the pieces. I had convinced myself that telling my friends was the hardest step, that once I spoke the truth aloud, the rest would somehow become easier. But the truth doesn't stop spreading once it's spoken. It has a way of slipping into places you're not ready for, into the cracks of your carefully ordered life, until it finds its way to the people you most fear will hear it. That was what happened with my family. It wasn't supposed to be like that. I had imagined a conversation of my own choosing, one where I controlled the words, where I could soften the blow and explain myself in the right tone at the right time. But reality rarely offers such clean opportunities. News travels in fragments, an overheard comment, a careless remark, a question asked in the wrong company. And so the truth that I had only just begun to admit to myself ended up in the hands of my family before I had the chance to prepare them, or myself. The first phone call came from my sister, Anna. She was younger than me by 3 years, sharp-tongued but fiercely loyal, the kind of person who rarely kept secrets. Her voice over the line was a mix of shock and curiosity. "Alex," she said without preamble, "is it true about you and this guy, Jason?" The sound of his name from her mouth made my chest tighten. I hesitated, my hand gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "Yes," I said finally. "It's true." There was silence, a long pause in which I could almost hear her breathing, as though she was trying to decide how to respond. "Well," she said eventually, her tone neutral, "I guess that explains why you've been disappearing. I don't know what Mom and Dad are going to say, though. The dread I felt in that moment was worse than any argument, because I knew she was right. My parents were not the type to take this lightly. When the conversation finally happened, it was worse than I had imagined. We were sitting at the kitchen table in my parents' apartment, the same table where I had done my homework as a child, where birthdays had been celebrated, where every family decision had once been made. The air was heavy with the smell of my mother's cooking, though none of us touched the food. My father sat with his arms crossed, his face unreadable, while my mother's hands trembled around the coffee cup she held too tightly. "So it's true," my father said finally, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through me. "You're with a man." There was no way to soften it, no way to frame it that would make it less shocking. I nodded. "Yes." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "Alex, we raised you better than this," she whispered, her voice breaking. The word struck me harder than I expected. Better than this. As though love, in its purest form, was somehow a failure. As though the honesty I had fought so hard to claim was a betrayal of everything they believed. I tried to explain, stumbling over my words, telling them that this wasn't about rebellion, that I hadn't chosen this as some kind of act against them. I told them it was simply who I was, who I had always been, though I hadn't realized it until now. But my father shook his head, his jaw set like stone. "This is not who you are," he said firmly. "This is a phase, a mistake. And if you don't stop, you'll regret it." I want to shout to demand that he listen, but my voice failed me. Instead, I sat there in silence, feeling the distance between us grow wider with every passing second. The days that followed were heavy with tension. Calls from my parents grew shorter, colder, filled with awkward pauses and unfinished sentences. At family gatherings, some cousins avoided my eyes altogether, while others whispered in corners, their voices hushed but not enough to escape my hearing. It was as though I had become a stranger in my own family, an outsider in the very place where I should have felt safest. I told myself that their rejection wouldn't break me, but the truth was it did. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with doubts. Had I made a mistake by being honest? Would life have been easier if I had stayed silent, if I had continued to live in shadows? The freedom I had tasted now felt poisoned by loneliness, and the silence of my phone was louder than any argument. But then something unexpected happened. It was at a small gathering in the city, an event organized by a local community group I had stumbled across online. I had hesitated to go, my finger hovering over the attend button for hours, but something inside me pushed me forward. The moment I walked into that room, I felt a shift. People were laughing, talking openly, their voices unafraid. They weren't hiding. They weren't apologizing. They were simply themselves. I met a man named David that night, not in the way I had met Jason, but as a friend, a guide. He was older, confident, the kind of person who had clearly fought his own battles and come out stronger on the other side. He introduced me to others, each with their own story, their own scars, their own triumphs. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I had almost forgotten existed: acceptance. These new friends didn't flinch when I spoke. They didn't hesitate or whisper or avoid my gaze. They listened. They understood. And slowly, through their kindness, I began to find my footing again. It didn't erase the pain of my family's rejection. That wound was still raw, still deep. But it reminded me that I wasn't alone, that the truth I carried wasn't a burden, but a bond connecting me to others who had walked the same difficult path. The irony wasn't lost on me, that the people who had known me my whole life could reject me so easily, while strangers I had just met could offer the acceptance I craved. But perhaps that was the lesson I needed to learn. Family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes it's built in unexpected places, forged in the fire of shared struggle. As I left that gathering, walking back into the cold night air of the city, I felt a new kind of strength settling inside me. It wasn't the unshakable confidence I had once envied in Jason, nor was it the easy laughter I used to share with my friends. It was quieter, steadier, born from the realization that even in the face of rejection, I could stand. The world hadn't become easier. The whispers would continue, the judgment would linger, and my family's disappointment would not vanish overnight. But I was no longer drowning in it. For the first time, I felt the possibility of building a life that wasn't dictated by fear, a life where acceptance wasn't begged for but found. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I walked it with a new understanding. That strength isn't the absence of doubt or pain. It's the choice to keep moving forward, even when the voices around you tell you to stop. Jason's name appeared on my phone late one evening, weeks after our last real conversation. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the glowing notification as if touching it would burn me. I hadn't expected to hear from him again. Not after everything that had happened. Not after the hollow silence he left behind. But there it was, his message waiting like a stone in my pocket, weighing me down before I even opened it. Can we talk? I made mistakes. I want another chance. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything we had been and everything we hadn't. I sat in my apartment with the city buzzing faintly outside, my heart racing as though the walls themselves were listening for my answer. I didn't reply right away. I couldn't, because what he was really asking wasn't just for a conversation. He was asking me to step back into a storm I had barely survived. The next day, we met at a cafe in the Lower East Side, a place crowded enough that I felt safe, but quiet enough that nothing would be lost in the noise. He looked the same, confident, collected, the same intensity in his eyes that had once pulled me in without resistance. But there was something else too, something softer at the edges, as though even he had been worn down by the time apart. I messed up, he said quickly, before I even sat down. I should have been honest with you from the beginning. I was stupid, selfish, but I can fix this. We can fix this. I listened, but my chest tightened with every word. Part of me wanted to believe him, to fall back into the rhythm we once shared, to let the current pull me again. But another part, stronger now, steadier, remembered the cracks, the betrayal, the emptiness I'd been left with. Why now? I asked, my voice calm but firmer than I felt. Why only after everything broke? He looked down, his hands restless against his coffee cup. Because I realized what I lost. I realized you were different, and I don't want to let that go. There was a time when those words would have disarmed me, a time when I would have leaned into them, desperate for validation, desperate for the promise of something real. But that time had passed. I had spent too many nights staring at the ceiling, piecing myself back together after he had broken my trust. I had fought too hard to stand on my own, to surrender that ground now. I shook my head slowly. Jason, you didn't just make a mistake. You made a choice. And so do I. My choice is not to go back. The silence that followed was sharp, but I didn't flinch. His expression shifted, anger flickering behind his eyes, then softening into something like regret. For the first time, I saw him not as the magnetic force that had once drawn me in, but as a man with flaws too deep to ignore. He opened his mouth as though to argue, but I raised a hand. I deserve honesty. I deserve respect. I deserve someone who doesn't make me doubt who I am every time I close my eyes. And that's not you. The words surprised even me. They were harsher than I had planned, sharper than I intended, but they were true. And for the first time, I felt the full strength of speaking them. Jason sat back, his jaw tight. Finally, he nodded, a bitter smile crossing his face. I guess that's it then. Yes, I said quietly. That's it. When I left the cafe, the air outside felt colder, but clearer. The city lights flickered against the wet pavement, and for the first time in months, I felt no invisible tether pulling me backward. I had chosen myself, and though the ache in my chest was real, it was an ache I could live with because it wasn't born of betrayal. It was born of freedom. The weeks that followed weren't easy. My family remained distant, my parents' voices colder than they had ever been, their words wrapped in disappointment. My friends still stumbled over conversations, unsure of how to navigate the new version of me they hadn't expected to meet. But something had shifted inside me. I no longer bent myself into shapes to fit their expectations. I no longer apologized for who I was. I started going back to the community group I had discovered earlier. Each time I walked into that room, I felt less like a stranger and more like I belonged. There is strength in hearing others speak their truths, in watching them live openly despite scars that mirrored my own. They weren't defined by rejection. They were defined by survival, by courage, by the choice to keep standing when the world told them to sit down. And slowly, piece by piece, I rebuilt myself. One evening, months later, I found myself at another family gathering. I almost didn't go, but something inside me insisted I should. The air was thick with unspoken words when I walked through the door, eyes flicking toward me, conversations pausing for just a fraction too long. But I held my head high. It was my cousin David, usually the loudest critic, who broke the silence. "You've changed," he said, his tone cautious but not unkind. I met his gaze steadily. "I've stopped hiding." For a moment, I expected the usual scoff, the dismissive shake of his head. But instead, he nodded slowly, as though grudging respect had slipped past his defenses. And just like that, I saw something shift. Not full acceptance, not yet, but recognition. Recognition that I had chosen a path he couldn't ignore. Others followed, in smaller ways. An aunt who once avoided me asked if I wanted more food. My sister smiled at me, without hesitation, for the first time in months. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. And starts matter. Standing there, surrounded by the murmur of voices and the clatter of dishes, I realized that respect doesn't always arrive in a single moment of triumph. Sometimes it comes in fragments, in gestures so small you could miss them if you weren't paying attention. And yet those fragments matter, because they build into something stronger over time. I didn't need everyone's approval anymore. What I needed was my own. And I found it. When I walked home that night, the city felt different. The same streets I had walked 100 times before now carried a new weight, a new brightness. I wasn't the same man who had once stumbled into Jason's barbershop, restless and unsure. I was someone who had been tested, broken, and rebuilt. Someone who had chosen honesty over illusion, self-respect over dependence. The power of choice isn't always about changing the world. Sometimes it's about refusing to let the world change you into something you're not. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly who I was meant to be.